On the 15th of August 1769, in a house on a narrow street in the city of Ajaccio on the island of Corsica, the cry of a newborn child rang out. 19-year-old Letizia Ramolino, wife of the local lawyer Carlo Maria Bonaparte, had given birth to a son. They named the boy Napoleone. On that day, no one could have predicted that this tiny Corsican would, 3.5 decades later, become an emperor who would redraw the map of Europe, and that his name would be spoken with awe and terror from Madrid to Moscow. Corsica, Napoleon's native island, was experiencing dramatic times in those years. For centuries, the island had belonged to the Republic of Genoa, but a year before the future emperor's birth, in 1768, Genoa sold it to France. The Corsicans, proud and freedom-loving Highlanders, did not wish to submit to their new masters. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was an associate of the legendary fighter for Corsican independence, Pascal Paoli. He participated in uprisings against the French, but after the rebels' defeat, he reconciled himself to the new authorities. This pragmatism, the ability to adapt to circumstances while maintaining honor, was passed on to his son. The Bonaparte family belonged to the minor nobility. Carlo worked as a magistrate and lawyer, his annual income totaling 22,500 francs, which allowed him to support a large family. Napoleon had 12 siblings, although not all survived to adulthood. His mother, Letizia, was a woman of strong will and strict disposition. She raised her children in Spartan conditions, teaching them discipline and patience. It was from her that Napoleon inherited his iron character and unyielding will. Later, he said that he owed his mother everything he achieved in life. The childhood of little Napoleone was spent in a cramped stone house on Rue St. Charles in Ajaccio. The house was 3 stories high, with thick walls that protected against the Mediterranean heat. Below were storage rooms, the 2nd floor housed the family, and the 3rd floor contained the children's and servants' bedrooms. The furniture was simple and sturdy, in the Corsican style. On the table were always olive oil, goat cheese, homemade bread, and grape wine. Letizia managed the household strictly, not allowing the children any luxuries, even when their financial situation improved. Napoleon received his first education at home. His father hired teachers who taught the boy sacred history, literacy, and the basics of arithmetic. At the age of 6, Napoleone was sent to a private school, where he studied Latin and the Italian language. The boy grew up withdrawn, pensive, and prone to solitude. He preferred books to games with his peers, often leaving for the mountains, where he would wander alone for hours, reflecting on what he had read. The Corsican landscapes, harsh and majestic, remained in his memory forever. At the age of 10, Napoleon's fate changed dramatically. Carlo Bonaparte, having recognized French authority, managed to obtain royal scholarships for his sons to study in France. The eldest, Joseph, was sent to a seminary, while Napoleon was placed in the Royal Military College at Autun. For a boy who spoke only the Corsican dialect of Italian, this was a real ordeal. He spoke French poorly, and his classmates mocked him, calling him a Corsican and a provincial. But the humiliation only hardened the young Bonaparte's character. He furiously learned French, studying day and night, striving to surpass his taunters. Already a few months later, in that same year of 1779, Napoleon was transferred to the military academy in the city of Brienne. This educational institution prepared future officers for the French army. The boy spent 5 years there, from age 10 to 15. Life in Brienne was harsh. The cadets rose at 6 in the morning, studied military disciplines, mathematics, history, and geography. They slept in cold barracks and ate simple food. Napoleon did not complain. On the contrary, he immersed himself in his studies, especially becoming interested in mathematics, history, and geography. At Brienne, Napoleon had no close friends. He remained an outsider, a proud Corsican among French aristocrats. His comrades continued to tease him for his accent, his poverty, and his provincial origins. But Bonaparte did not seek their approval. He read voraciously, was fascinated by military history, and studied the campaigns of the great commanders of antiquity. Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Julius Caesar. He spent all his free time in the academy library, making notes, compiling summaries, and building plans for future battles in his mind. Teachers noted his outstanding abilities, especially in mathematics and artillery. In 1784, at 15, Napoleon graduated from Brienne with distinction, The examination commission recognized him as one of the best students and recommended him for admission to the Paris Military Academy. This was the most prestigious military educational institution in France, a forge for the officer elite. Only the chosen were admitted. For a Corsican boy from a modest family, this was an incredible success. In the autumn of 1784, he arrived in Paris. The Paris Military Academy was located on the Champ de Mars. The building was majestic, with columns, wide staircases, and spacious auditoriums. The best minds of France taught there. Among the professors were the famous mathematician Gaspard Monge, the creator of descriptive geometry, and the astronomer Pierre-Simon Laplace, author of celestial mechanics. Napoleon eagerly absorbed the knowledge. He specialized in artillery, the most scientific branch of the military, which required deep knowledge of mathematics and physics. His fellow students recalled that Bonaparte was always immersed in calculations, drawing trajectories of shells and calculating firing ranges. In 1785, Napoleon Bonaparte graduated from the Paris Military Academy. He was only 16, but the commission unanimously recognized him as ready for officer service. Out of 42 graduates in his class, he ranked 42nd in terms of nobility of birth, but one of the first in knowledge. In September of that same year, the young lieutenant received an appointment to the La Fère Artillery Regiment, stationed in the city of Valence in southern France. The life of a young officer was not wealthy. A lieutenant's salary was about 1,100 francs a year, a third of which went to uniforms, weapons, and equipment. Napoleon rented a modest room in Valence and ate in cheap taverns that served onion soup, roast lamb, coarse bread, and local wine. He sent most of his money to his mother in Corsica, where the family found itself in a difficult position after his father's death in 1785. Letizia was left with 8 children, and the eldest son considered it his duty to help her. Service in the provincial garrison was not burdensome. Exercises were held irregularly, and officers spent most of their time in idleness. But Napoleon was not like that. He continued his self-education with the same perseverance. His room was filled with bookshelves containing volumes on history, philosophy, and military art. He read Plutarch and Tacitus, studied the works of Montesquieu and Rousseau, and pored over the memoirs of great commanders. His notebooks were filled with summaries, reflections, and plans. Comrades considered him eccentric, withdrawn, and unsociable, but no one doubted his abilities. In 1794, the revolution began in France. On July 14, the Parisians stormed the Bastille, a royal prison and symbol of absolutism. News of this event shocked all of Europe. The old order, which had seemed unshakable, collapsed overnight. King Louis XVI was forced to recognize the new reality. The National Assembly proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. France entered a new era. Napoleon met the revolution with enthusiasm. Like many young provincial officers, he saw in it the triumph of justice over the privileges of the nobility. The ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity resonated in his heart. He read revolutionary newspapers, argued with his comrades, and wrote political pamphlets. In 1790, he joined the Jacobin Club of Valence, the most radical political organization of that time. His speeches at the club's meetings were fiery and persuasive. At the same time, Napoleon did not forget his native Corsica. The island was also gripped by revolutionary fervor. Pascal Paoli, the hero of Corsican independence, returned from exile and headed the local government. Bonaparte visited Corsica several times, trying to secure important posts there. He dreamed of heading the Corsican National Guard, but his ambitions met with resistance from the local nobility. Furthermore, Paoli, who strove for Corsica's independence from France, soon disagreed with the views of the Bonaparte family, who supported the Jacobins and a unified French Republic. In 1792, the conflict between Paoli and the Bonapartes reached its peak. Paoli declared the Bonaparte family traitors to the Corsican cause. Their house in Ajaccio was looted and burned by Paoli's supporters. Letizia and her children fled to France. For Napoleon, this was a turning point. He broke with Corsica forever, along with his dreams of Corsican independence. From then on, he was French, and his fate was bound to France. Over time, he would change the spelling of the surname Bonaparte to the French style, becoming Bonaparte. In 1793, France was declared a republic. King Louis XVI was executed on the guillotine on January 21, European monarchies, shocked by the regicide, united against revolutionary France. A war began that would last, with interruptions, for over 20 years. France found itself surrounded by enemies: Austria, Prussia, England, Spain, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and the German principalities rose against the Republic. Inside the country, royalist revolts flared up. The situation seemed desperate. It was in those formidable days that Napoleon Bonaparte first distinguished himself as a military commander. In the summer of 1793, a royalist revolt broke out in the south of France. The city of Toulon, the Republic's main naval base on the Mediterranean, was captured by rebels and handed over to the British. The English fleet entered Toulon harbor. For the Republic, this was a catastrophe. The convention sent an army to suppress the revolt under the command of General Dugommier. The commander of the artillery was wounded, and on the recommendation of a representative of the convention, the young Captain Bonaparte was appointed in his place. Napoleon was 24 years old. This was his first real military operation. He arrived at Toulon in September 1793 and immediately assessed the situation. The city was impregnable from the land, protected by powerful fortifications and English ships at sea. But Bonaparte found a solution. He proposed capturing the Aiguillette fort, which dominated the entrance to the harbor. If artillery were placed there, the English ships would come under fire and be forced to leave. Without the fleet's support, the Toulon garrison would not be able to hold out. The plan was daring but logical. Dugommier agreed. On the 17th of December 1793, Republican troops stormed and took the Aiguillette fort. Bonaparte personally directed the artillery under enemy fire. He was wounded in the thigh by a bayonet but remained in the ranks. The batteries opened fire on the English ships. Admiral Hood ordered the fleet to leave the harbor. On December 19, the Royalists capitulated. Toulon was taken. The Republic had won a crucial victory. The success at Toulon made Napoleon Bonaparte's name known. Representatives of the convention in the army: Augustin Robespierre, younger brother of the all-powerful Maximilien Robespierre, and Paul Barras, the future head of the Directory, noted the young artilleryman's outstanding abilities in their reports. On the 22nd of December 1793, the 24-year-old Bonaparte was promoted to brigadier general. This was a meteoric rise. In just a few months, he had gone from captain to general. After Toulon, Napoleon's fate seemed predetermined. The young general received an appointment as commander of the artillery of the Army of Italy. But then a political storm broke out, nearly ruining his career. On the 27th of July 1794, a coup d'état occurred in France. Maximilien Robespierre, the head of the Jacobin dictatorship, was overthrown and executed. A reaction began. Jacobins were arrested, tried, and sent to the guillotine. Bonaparte, known for his ties to the Robespierres, fell under suspicion. In August 1794, Napoleon was arrested in Nice. He was accused of Jacobin sympathies and participation in a conspiracy. He spent 2 weeks in prison, awaiting trial. It seemed his career, and perhaps his life, was over. But fate smiled upon him. The investigation found no evidence of his guilt. Moreover, his army comrades interceded for him, emphasizing his services at Toulon. At the end of August, Bonaparte was released, but he was dismissed from his post. He was left with nothing to do, without money, and without prospects. Napoleon spent the next year in Paris, trying to obtain a new appointment. He lived in a cheap hotel on Rue des Capucines and ate in workers' diners, where they served bean soup and black bread. Money was catastrophically short. His uniform had become threadbare, and his boots were worn out. Bonaparte wrote letters to the Ministry of War and sought audiences with officials, but received rejections. He was considered for the position of infantry brigade commander in the Vendée, where the Republic was fighting royalist insurgents, but he refused, considering it a demotion for an artilleryman. During those difficult months, Napoleon seriously thought about leaving France. He even offered his services to the Turkish Sultan, who was looking for European officers to modernize his army. But fate decided otherwise. On the 5th of October 1795, a royalist revolt broke out in Paris. The section's neighborhood assemblies of Parisians, dissatisfied with the convention government, rose in rebellion. 30,000 National Guardsmen, armed with cannons and muskets, marched on the Tuileries, where the convention sat. The government, in a panic, looked for a military leader capable of protecting the convention. Paul Barras, appointed commander of the troops in Paris, remembered Bonaparte, who had distinguished himself at Toulon. He summoned Napoleon and entrusted him with the organization of the defense. Bonaparte had only a few hours. He acted decisively. He sent the cavalryman Murat with a squadron to retrieve cannons kept in a military camp outside Paris. Murat succeeded, beating the rebels to it. Napoleon positioned artillery at the bridges and squares covering the approaches to the Tuileries. On 13 Vendemiaire, as October 5 was called according to the revolutionary calendar, the rebels attacked. Columns of the National Guard, shouting royalist slogans, went to storm the government quarter. Bonaparte ordered fire to be opened. Grapeshot mowed down the ranks of the attackers. The streets of Paris turned into a slaughterhouse. By evening, the revolt was suppressed. About 300 people had died. The convention was saved. Bonaparte was once again a hero. On October 16, he was promoted to Major General and appointed commander of the Paris garrison. The success of 13 Vendemiaire opened the doors to high society for Napoleon. He became a regular in the salons where politicians, financiers, and writers gathered. He was seen at the home of Paul Barras, the de facto ruler of France after the establishment of the Directory regime. There, he met Josephine de Beauharnais, the widow of a viscount guillotined during the Terror. Josephine was 32 years old and had 2 children from her first marriage. She was beautiful, elegant, and knew how to be charming. Napoleon fell in love passionately and recklessly. Josephine did not immediately return his feelings. She saw the young general as an advantageous match, but nothing more. She had lovers, among whom was the all-powerful Barras, but Bonaparte pursued her with such fervor that she finally agreed. On the 9th of March 1796, they were married. The wedding was modest and civil, held at the town hall of the 2nd arrondissement of Paris. The witnesses were Barras and Bonaparte's adjutant. The next day, Napoleon was to leave for Nice, to his new post. On the 2nd of March 1796, the Directory appointed Bonaparte commander of the Army of Italy. It was one of the Republic's 3 main armies, but the weakest. The Army of Italy numbered about 40,000 men, poorly clothed, poorly armed, and demoralized. For months, soldiers had not received pay, ate whatever they could find, and looted surrounding villages. The officers were unhappy with the appointment of a 27-year-old upstart. Generals Augereau, Massena, and Serrurier, older than him in age and experience, met the new commander coldly, but Napoleon quickly won their respect. On the 27th of March 1796, he arrived at the army headquarters in Nice. The next day, he issued his first orders. His energy was indomitable. He inspected the troops, checked the warehouses, interrogated prisoners, and studied the maps. In a few days, he developed a campaign plan. The idea was simple and daring. The Army of Italy was facing the Austrians and the Sardinians, who outnumbered them. But the opponents were separated by mountains. Bonaparte decided to strike in the center, between them, and defeat each one separately. On the 12th of April 1796, the French army moved on the offensive. In 2 weeks, Bonaparte fought 6 battles and won them all. At Montenotte, Millesimo, Dago, and Mondovì, he crushed the Austrians and Sardinians. On April 28, the King of Sardinia, Victor Amadeus III, signed an armistice and left the war. Northern Italy lay before the French. On May 10, they entered Milan, the capital of Lombardy. The population greeted them as liberators from the Austrian yoke. Bonaparte founded the Cisalpine Republic, a vassal state under the French protectorate. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1796, the campaign continued. The Austrians tried to win back Italy, but Bonaparte defeated them time and time again. At Lodi, Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli, he demonstrated brilliant military art. His tactics were based on speed, concentration of forces at the decisive point, and surprise. He moved the army with incredible speed, making marches of 30 to 40 kilometers a day. His opponents could not keep up with his maneuvers. By the end of the year, the Austrian army in Italy was routed. In the spring of 1797, Napoleon moved the army into the very heart of the Habsburg Empire. The French crossed the Alps and invaded Austria. They reached Leoben, 120 kilometers from Vienna. Emperor Francis II requested peace. On the 17th of October, 1797, in the town of Campo Formio, A peace treaty was signed. Austria recognized French conquests in Italy, receiving the Republic of Venice in exchange. The War of the First Coalition, which lasted 5 years, ended in victory for France. Napoleon returned to Paris a hero. On the 5th of December 1797, the Directory hosted a grand reception for him in the courtyard of the Luxembourg Palace. Crowds of Parisians welcomed the victor. Newspapers praised him to the skies, comparing him to Caesar and Alexander the Great. Politicians fawned over him, and society ladies dreamed of an introduction. At 28, Bonaparte was the most famous man in France. But fame did not turn his head. He assessed his position soberly. He was popular, but he had no power. The Directory feared him, seeing him as a potential dictator. To remove the dangerous general from Paris, the Directory entrusted him with the preparation of an invasion of England. Napoleon went to inspect the troops on the English Channel coast. He examined the ports, the fleet, and the fortifications. The conclusion was disappointing. The English fleet dominated the sea. A landing in England without naval superiority was suicide. Bonaparte reported this to the Directory and proposed an alternative plan. Instead of England, strike at Egypt, a British colony that controlled the route to India. Capturing Egypt would undermine British power in the east. The Directory agreed. The Egyptian expedition solved 2 problems. First, it weakened England, France's only remaining opponent. Second, it removed Bonaparte from the capital. In the spring of 1798, preparations began. In Toulon, a fleet gathered, 13 ships of the line, 7 frigates, and about 200 transports. The army numbered 38,000 men. In addition to the military, scientists, engineers, and artists were included in the expedition. Napoleon conceived not just a conquest, but a scientific exploration of Egypt. On the 19th of May 1798, the fleet left Toulon. The route lay across the Mediterranean Sea, past Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily. On June 10, the French captured Malta, the island of the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights capitulated without a fight. Napoleon spent a week on Malta, reorganized the administration, and confiscated the order's treasures to replenish the treasury. Then the fleet moved further east. The English squadron of Admiral Nelson scoured the Mediterranean Sea looking for the French, but did not find them. On the 1st of July 1798, the French landed in Egypt, near Alexandria. The city was taken by storm the following day. Napoleon issued a proclamation in Arabic, assuring the Egyptians of France's friendship, respect for Islam, and liberation from Turkish oppression. Then the army moved to Cairo, the capital of Egypt. The crossing through the desert was grueling. There was a terrible heat, over 40 degrees. The soldiers suffered from thirst and sandstorms and were plagued by diseases. Many cursed Bonaparte for undertaking this adventure. On July 21, near the village of Mbabe, by Cairo, the French met the army of the Mamluks, the rulers of Egypt. The Mamluks were magnificent warriors, cavalrymen encased in steel and armed with sabers and pistols. There were about 12,000 of them. Bonaparte formed his infantry into squares bristling with bayonets. The Mamluk cavalry attacked with frantic fury but broke against the wall of bayonets and musket fire. By evening, the battle was won. The French lost about 300 men, the Mamluks, several thousand. This battle entered history as the Battle of the Pyramids, although the pyramids were located several kilometers away. On July 24, the French entered Cairo. Napoleon set up his headquarters in the luxurious palace of the former Mamluk rulers. He received Egyptian sheikhs, assured them of his respect for Islam, and even hinted at the possibility of converting to the Muslim faith. He created the Egyptian Institute, where French scientists studied the antiquities of the land of the pharaohs. Schools, hospitals, and printing houses were opened. The French administration modernized the management and built bridges, roads, and canals. But the Egyptians did not want French rule, seeing the newcomers as infidel occupiers. On the 1st of August 1798, catastrophic news arrived. In Abu Qir Bay, Admiral Nelson caught the French fleet and destroyed it. Of 13 ships of the line, 11 were lost. Bonaparte's army was cut off from France, trapped in Egypt. Supply was impossible. Turkey, the nominal suzerain of Egypt, declared war on France. England, Russia, Austria, and the Kingdom of Naples created the Second Anti-French Coalition. The situation was desperate. Napoleon did not lose heart. In the spring of 1799, he moved the army into Syria, a Turkish province. He dreamed of reaching Constantinople and repeating the path of Alexander the Great, but the campaign failed. The French took Gaza and Jaffa but got stuck under the fortress of Acre. The siege lasted 2 months. The French stormed the walls again and again, but unsuccessfully. The garrison of Acre, commanded by the French émigré Colonel Philippot, repelled all attacks. The English fleet supplied the defenders. On May 20, Bonaparte lifted the siege and retreated to Egypt. In the summer of 1799, a Turkish army arrived at Abu Qir, sent by the Sultan to liberate Egypt. Napoleon attacked the Turks and routed them in a fierce battle on July 25, but this was a useless victory. The army was melting away from diseases. The plague mowed down thousands of soldiers. Egypt had turned into a trap. In August, newspapers from France arrived in Cairo, sent by the English flagship under the guise of a humanitarian gesture. From them, Bonaparte learned about the dire situation of the Republic. Russian-Austrian armies were pushing back the French in Italy and Germany. The Directory was mired in corruption and infighting. France needed a savior. On the 23rd of August, 1799, Napoleon secretly left Egypt. He boarded a frigate with a few companions, abandoning the army to its fate. He handed over command to General Kleber. This was desertion, a betrayal of his comrades. But Bonaparte did not hesitate. Egypt was a dead end. France offered opportunities. On October 9th, the frigate docked near Fréjus in southern France. Napoleon stepped onto native soil. News of his return instantly flew across the country. France was waiting for a hero. On the 16th of October, 1799, Napoleon arrived in Paris. He was met as the savior of the fatherland. Crowds of people filled the streets, shouting greetings. Military bands played marches. Newspapers published enthusiastic articles. Politicians of all stripes sought an audience with the celebrated general. The Directory was in a panic. The 5 directors who ruled France hated each other, spun intrigues, and stole from the treasury. The regime was falling apart. Everyone understood that changes were needed. But no one knew what kind. One of the directors was Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a former priest, ideologue of the revolution, and author of the famous pamphlet What is the Third Estate? Sieyès dreamed of a coup that would establish a strong executive power. He needed a general with an army. Bonaparte fit the bill perfectly. They met and conspired. The plan was simple. On November 9th, the Council of Elders, the upper house of Parliament, under the pretext of an imminent Jacobin conspiracy, would decree the transfer of its sessions to St. Cloud, a suburb of Paris. Command of the Paris garrison would be entrusted to Bonaparte. He would surround the palace, intimidate the deputies, and force them to vote for a new constitution. On the morning of November 9, the 18th of Brumaire according to the revolutionary calendar, the coup began. The Council of Elders, in fear, voted for the transfer of sessions to St. Cloud. Bonaparte was appointed commander of the troops. 3 directors, participants in the plot, resigned. The 2 remaining were arrested. The Directory ceased to exist. The next day, November 10, Napoleon arrived with troops at St. Cloud, where the Council of Elders and the Council of 500, the lower house, were meeting. The deputies were in turmoil. Many shouted about betrayal and accused Bonaparte of usurping power. Napoleon entered the meeting hall of the Council of 500. He was met with shouts of outlaw and down with the dictator. Jacobin deputies rushed at him. Several grabbed his uniform, and someone struck him. Grenadiers pulled the general from the hall. The situation was critical. The coup could have failed. Then Napoleon's brother Lucien, who was chairing the Council of 500, stepped in. He went out to the troops and shouted that the Jacobins had been bribed by the English and wanted to kill Bonaparte, the savior of the Republic. Soldiers burst into the palace. The deputies fled in a panic, jumping out of windows. By evening, the remnants of the compliant deputies were gathered. They voted for the dissolution of the Directory and the creation of a provisional government of 3 consuls. The consuls became Bonaparte, Sieyès, and Roger Ducos. Over the next few weeks, a new constitution was drafted. Sieyès presented a project, but Bonaparte remade it in his own way. The constitution of the year 8 established the consulate regime. Executive power belonged to 3 consuls, but in reality, only to the first. Napoleon Bonaparte became the first consul. He appointed ministers, generals, and officials, and initiated laws. Legislative power was divided among 4 chambers, stripped of real influence. On the 24th of December 1799, the new constitution was approved by plebiscite. 3 million Frenchmen voted for, and 1,500 against. Napoleon began to organize the state. He worked 18 hours a day, delving into every detail. His residence became the Tuileries Palace, the former royal residence in the center of Paris. The palace was gloomy and cold, with long corridors and high ceilings. The first consul's office was on the 2nd floor. It contained a mahogany desk, leather armchairs, and bookshelves. Maps of Europe hung on the walls. Here were made decisions that changed the fates of millions of people. The first task was the reconciliation of French society, divided by a decade of revolution. Napoleon announced a policy of national unity. He amnestied royalist émigrés and allowed them to return to France if they swore allegiance to the Republic. He ended the persecution of priests and allowed churches to be reopened. At the same time, he dealt harshly with irreconcilable opponents. Royalists who staged an assassination attempt on him in December 1800 were executed by the dozens. Jacobins who refused to submit to the new regime were exiled. Administrative reform created a centralized state. The old division into departments remained. But power now belonged to prefects appointed by Paris. Elected bodies were abolished. The prefect was subordinate to the Minister of the Interior, who in turn answered to the first consul. Thus, a vertical of power was established from the capital to every village. Bonaparte liked to repeat that from his office in the Tuileries, he could control the mayor of the smallest commune in France. Financial reform stabilized the economy. The Bank of France was created, issuing paper money backed by gold. The tax system was streamlined. A new land cadastre was introduced, which determined the amount of taxes. The budget was balanced. The state debt, which had ruined the monarchy and the Directory, was restructured. France exited the financial crisis. Trade and industry came to life. Prices stabilized. White bread appeared in bakeries again. The most important achievement of the consulate was the Civil Code, a body of laws regulating all aspects of private life. Work on the code began in 1800. Napoleon personally participated in discussions. Attending meetings of the drafting commission, he insisted on clarity of formulation and practicality of norms. The code was finished in 1804 and consisted of 2,281 articles, divided into 3 books. The first book regulated family relations, the second property, and the third inheritance and obligations. The Civil Code enshrined the main gains of the Revolution: equality of citizens before the law, the abolition of estate privileges, freedom of religion, and the inviolability of private property. At the same time, the code was conservative regarding family issues. The father had unlimited power over his wife and children. A woman could not dispose of her property without her husband's consent. Divorce was extremely difficult. Napoleon considered the family the foundation of the state and insisted on patriarchal principles. The code operated in France for over a century and was adopted as a model in many countries in Europe and America. Napoleon resolved the religious issue by signing a concordat with Pope Pius VII. The negotiations lasted a year and concluded in July 1801. According to the concordat, Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the majority of Frenchmen, but not as the state religion. The Church renounced its claims to lands confiscated by the Revolution. Priests were appointed by the state and received a salary from the treasury. Thus, the Church was subordinated to the state but regained its legal status. This reconciled millions of devout Catholics with the regime. Educational reform created a system of state schools, lyceums, secondary educational institutions preparing officials and officers were established. The curriculum included Latin, mathematics, history, and geography. Teaching was secular but respectful of religion. The best graduates of the lyceums entered higher schools, such as the Polytechnic and the Normal School, which prepared engineers and teachers. Napoleon considered education a tool for forming loyal citizens. Textbooks were approved by the government, and the directors of lyceums were appointed by the minister. On the 2nd of December 1804, a sight never before seen took place in the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris. The 35-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of the French. The ceremony was magnificent. The cathedral was decorated with carpets and tapestries, and a throne was placed on an elevated platform. Pope Pius VII arrived from Rome to consecrate the coronation. Marshals, ministers, diplomats, and the entire nobility of the empire were present. Napoleon was dressed in a mantle of purple velvet embroidered with gold bees, an ancient symbol of the Frankish kings. On his head was a crown of gold and diamonds. By tradition, the emperor was to receive the crown from the hands of the pope. But Napoleon did otherwise. He took the crown from the altar and placed it on his own head. Then he crowned Josephine, who was kneeling before him, empress. This gesture symbolized that his power came not from God, but from his own strength and the will of the people. Pius VII was insulted, but remained silent. After the ceremony, Napoleon took an oath to protect the territorial integrity of the Republic, to respect freedom of religion, equality of rights, and political and civil liberty. Formally, France remained a republic, but an emperor stood at its head. The path to the empire began 2 years earlier. In August 1802, a plebiscite proclaimed Bonaparte consul for life with the right to appoint a successor. This effectively restored the monarchy. In May 1804, the Senate proposed passing power down by inheritance, establishing an empire. On May 18, the Senate proclaimed Napoleon Bonaparte Emperor of the French. A plebiscite in November approved this decision by 3.5 million votes to 2,500. France became an empire, the first in Europe, not based on feudal principles. The empire created a new aristocracy. Napoleon distributed titles and lands to his associates. 18 generals received the rank of Marshal of the Empire. Among them were Bernadotte, Murat, Ney, Davout, Soult, and Massena, names that thundered on the fields of battle. Titles of Duke, Count, and Baron were established. But this was an aristocracy of merit, not of birth. Marshal Ney, the son of a cooper, became the Duke of Elchingen. Murat, the son of an innkeeper, married Napoleon's sister and became King of Naples. Social elevators worked as never before, but the coronation took place at a moment of growing external threat. England, the implacable enemy of France, was creating a third anti-French coalition. Russia, Austria, Sweden, and Naples joined it. The coalition fielded over 500,000 soldiers against France. The plan was simple. Russian and Austrian armies would advance from the east, the English would land on the coast, and the Swedes would attack from the north. Napoleon would find himself in a ring, but the emperor did not lose his head. He decided to defeat his enemies one by one, using his advantage internal lines of communication and speed of maneuvering. In the summer of 1805, the Grand Army, as the French troops were now called, stood in camp at Boulogne on the English Channel. Napoleon was preparing an invasion of England, had built flat-bottomed barges to transport the troops, and had assembled thousands of soldiers. But the English fleet was too strong. In August, Vice Admiral Nelson defeated the French fleet at Trafalgar. A landing in England became impossible. Then Napoleon turned his army abruptly to the east. On the 29th of August, 1805, the Grand Army marched from the English Channel to the Rhine. The march was swift. In 3 weeks, the French traveled over 600 kilometers and found themselves in Bavaria, on the border with Austria. The Austrian army of General Mack, advancing to the west, was caught by surprise. Napoleon surrounded it in the city of Ulm. On the 20th of October, 1805, Mack capitulated. 30,000 Austrians surrendered without a serious fight. This was a brilliant victory, won by maneuver, not by bloodshed. The road to Vienna was open. On November 13, the French entered Vienna without a fight. Emperor Francis II fled to Moravia, where he joined the Russian army sent by Tsar Alexander I to help the Austrians. The Allied forces numbered about 90,000 men. Napoleon had 70,000. He took a position near the village of Austerlitz in Moravia and waited. Alexander I, young and inexperienced, craved glory. His advisors convinced him to attack. On the 2nd of December 1805, exactly a year after the coronation, the Battle of Austerlitz took place, which went down in history as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, luring the enemy in. The Allies took the bait. They threw their main forces against the French right flank, hoping to cut Napoleon off from Vienna. But this was exactly what he was waiting for. At the decisive moment, the French center and left flank, commanded by Marshal Soult, attacked the weakened center of the Allies and broke through. The Allied army was split in two. The rout began. Units that had attacked the French right flank were cut off and fled across frozen ponds. French artillery fired at the ice, and thousands of soldiers drowned in the freezing water. By evening, the battle was over. The Allies had lost 27,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The French, 4,000. Alexander I fled the battlefield in tears. Francis II requested peace. On December 26, a peace treaty was signed in Pressburg. Austria lost huge territories, paid a contribution, and left the coalition. Austerlitz became the pinnacle of Napoleon's command art. This battle is studied in all military academies of the world as a model of tactical perfection. The emperor was at the height of his fame. All of Europe trembled before him. Prussia, which had stayed on the sidelines, hastened to conclude an alliance. German states united into the Confederation of the Rhine under the French Protectorate. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which had existed for 1,000 years, was abolished. Europe was being redrawn by the will of the French emperor, but the peace was short-lived. In the autumn of 1806, Prussia, incited by England and Russia, declared war on France. The Prussian army was considered the best in Europe, the heir to the traditions of Frederick the Great. Prussian King Frederick William III was confident of victory, but he collided with Napoleon. On the 14th of October 1806, in the double battle at Jena and Austerlitz, the Prussian army was annihilated. It was not a defeat, but a catastrophe. Prussian troops fled in a panic, abandoning banners and cannons. On October 27, Napoleon solemnly entered Berlin. He visited the grave of Frederick the Great in Potsdam, paid tribute to the ashes of the great commander, but took his sword as a trophy. From Berlin, the emperor issued a decree on the continental blockade of England. All countries in Europe were forbidden from trading with the British Isles. Napoleon believed that an economic blockade would force England to capitulate. This was a strategic error that ultimately led him to ruin. In the winter of 1806-1807, the war continued in Poland. The Russian army came to the aid of Prussia. In February, at Eylau, a bloody battle occurred that did not result in victory for either side. Both armies lost tens of thousands of men killed or wounded. The battlefield was littered with corpses. For the first time, Napoleon encountered an opponent that could not be defeated with one blow. The Russians retreated, but did not surrender. On the 14th of June 1807, at Friedland, Napoleon finally defeated the Russian army. Russian losses amounted to 20,000 men. Tsar Alexander I requested peace. On June 25, the two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, on the border between Russia and Prussia. They spoke in private for several hours. On July 7, the Treaty of Tilsit was signed. Russia recognized all of France's conquests, joined the continental blockade of England, and received freedom of action in the war with Sweden and Turkey. Prussia lost half of its territory and paid a huge contribution. After Tilsit, Napoleon was at the height of his power. He controlled all of continental Europe, from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. His brothers became kings. Joseph ruled in Naples, then in Spain. Louis received Holland. Jerome became King of Westphalia, an artificial state created from Prussian and German lands. Brother-in-law Murat replaced Joseph in Naples. Stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais, was Viceroy of Italy. Europe had turned into a family business of the Bonaparte, but the emperor's family happiness was clouded by one circumstance. Josephine could not bear him an heir. She was over 40 in age when women of that era were considered old. She had children from her first marriage, but Napoleon needed a son of his own, a successor to the dynasty. He thought more and more often about divorce. Josephine guessed this and suffered. She truly loved her husband, despite her affairs in the first years of their marriage. But Napoleon was inexorable. The empire needed a dynasty. In 1808, Napoleon made a fatal mistake that became the beginning of his fall. He decided to conquer Spain. Formally, Spain was an ally of France, ruled by the weak King Charles IV and his favorite, Godoy. But Napoleon considered the Spanish Bourbons unreliable and decided to replace them with his brother, under the pretext of a campaign against Portugal, which had not joined the continental blockade. French troops entered Spain. In the spring of 1808, in the city of Bayonne on the French border, Napoleon met with the Spanish royal family. He forced Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII to abdicate the throne. He handed the crown of Spain to his brother Joseph, moving him from Naples. It seemed everything had gone smoothly, but the Spanish people did not accept the French king. On May 2, an uprising broke out in Madrid. The French garrison brutally suppressed it, shooting hundreds of insurgents. This event was captured in paintings by the artist Goya. The uprising was not suppressed. It only flared up with new force. A guerrilla war, or guerrilla, as the Spaniards called it, erupted across Spain. Peasants, monks, and nobles took up arms. They set ambushes, attacked French supply convoys, and killed straggling soldiers. The French responded with brutal repressions, burning villages and hanging prisoners. The war turned into a bloody slaughter without rules. This was a war where there was no front, where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. In the summer of 1808, the French army of General Dupont was surrounded by Spanish rebels and the regular army at Belen in Andalusia. On July 22, 18,000 Frenchmen capitulated. This was the first case of an entire French army surrendering during the Napoleonic Wars. All of Europe was shocked. The myth of the invincibility of the Grand Army collapsed. Napoleon realized he had underestimated the Spaniards. In the autumn of 1808, the emperor personally arrived in Spain at the head of a 200,000-strong army. In 2 months, he defeated the Spanish regular forces, took Madrid, and restored Joseph to the throne. But he could not suppress the guerrilla war. As soon as French troops left an area, the rebels appeared again. Controlling a huge country with a hostile population was impossible. Napoleon left 250,000 soldiers in Spain and returned to France. The Spanish War lasted 6 years, from 1808 to 1814. It cost France 300,000 men killed or dead from disease. Napoleon called it the Spanish ulcer, which drained the strength of the empire. An English army under the command of the Duke of Wellington landed in Portugal and supported the Spanish guerrillas. The French could not win a decisive victory. This was a war of attrition that France was losing. In the spring of 1809, while Napoleon was occupied in Spain, Austria Wistapila against France for the 5th time. Archduke Charles led the Austrian army on the offensive in Bavaria. Napoleon hurriedly returned from Spain. The April campaign was swift. At Abensberg, Landshut, and Eckmühl, he defeated the Austrians and moved on Vienna. On May 13, the French took the Austrian capital for the 2nd time, but the Austrian army was not destroyed. Archduke Charles retreated across the Danube and took up strong positions. Napoleon decided to cross the river and attack. On May 21-22, at the village of Aspern-Essling, a battle occurred that became the emperor's first serious defeat. The Austrians repelled the French attacks and forced Napoleon to retreat back across the Danube. The French lost 20,000 men. Among the dead was Marshal Lannes, one of the empire's best commanders. Napoleon did not lose heart. He brought up reinforcements, brought the army up to 180,000, and carefully prepared a new crossing. On July 5-6, 1809, the largest battle of that war took place at Wagram. 200,000 French fought against 150,000 Austrians. The battle lasted 2 days and was exceptionally bloody. Napoleon used massed artillery fire for the first time, collecting 100 guns into one battery that broke the Austrian center. By the evening of the 2nd day, the Austrians retreated. The victory at Wagram was won, but at what a cost? The French lost more than 30,000 men. The Austrians, about 40,000. The battlefield was a terrifying sight. Marshal Berthier, the chief of staff, wept upon seeing the mountains of corpses. Napoleon was gloomy. He understood that the wars were becoming bloodier and the enemies more stubborn. But Austria was broken. On October 14, in Schönbrunn, a peace treaty was signed. Austria lost its access to the Adriatic Sea, paid a contribution, and reduced its army. After the Austrian campaign, Napoleon finally decided on a divorce from Josephine. On the 15th of December 1809, in the Tuileries Palace, the divorce ceremony took place. Both spouses wept. Josephine retained the title of Empress and received a generous allowance. She settled in the Malmaison castle outside Paris, where she lived out the rest of her days, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Napoleon visited her sometimes, and they maintained good relations. But the emperor had to think about a dynasty. A bride was sought among European princesses, At first, the candidacy of Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna, sister of Russian Emperor Alexander I, was considered, but the Tsar replied evasively that his sister was too young, she was only 15. This was a polite refusal. Then the choice fell on Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis II. She was 18 years old, beautiful, and came from the most ancient royal line of the Habsburgs. Francis agreed, hoping to secure Austria through an alliance with Napoleon. On the 2nd of April 1810, Napoleon and Marie-Louise were married in the Louvre. The wedding was grand. All the marshals and ministers of the empire, the diplomatic corps, and the court participated in the ceremony. The emperor was happy. He became truly attached to his young wife. Despite the 23-year age difference, Marie-Louise was obedient and quiet, and admired her husband. And, most importantly, a year later, on the 20th of March 1811, she gave birth to a son. The boy was named Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles, and he received the title of King of Rome. The dynasty was secured. Paris rejoiced. In 1811, relations between France and Russia began to deteriorate rapidly. The reason was the continental blockade of England, which Russia had joined by the Treaty of Tilsit. The blockade hit the Russian economy. Russia exported timber, hemp, and grain to England and received manufactured goods in exchange. The ban on trade ruined Russian landlords and merchants. Alexander I, under pressure from the nobility, began to violate the blockade. Napoleon demanded compliance with the treaty. There were other contradictions as well. Napoleon created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw from Polish lands taken from Prussia and Austria. Russia saw this as a threat, fearing that the next step would be the restoration of an independent Poland on lands that had gone to Russia as a result of the partitions. Napoleon annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, a possession of a relative of the Russian emperor, to France. Alexander protested, but Napoleon ignored the protests. By 1812, it was clear that war was inevitable. Napoleon prepared for the campaign against Russia on an unprecedented scale. An army of over 600,000 men was assembled, the largest in the history of Europe up to that time. In addition to the French, it included Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch, Spaniards, and Croats, representatives of all the conquered peoples. Huge warehouses of food, ammunition, and forage were created. Napoleon studied maps of Russia and read books about the Russian climate and the campaign of Charles XII, which ended in defeat at Poltava. He prepared thoroughly. On the 24th of June 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Niemen and invaded Russia. Napoleon expected the Russians to give a general battle at the border, where he would defeat them in one blow, as at Austerlitz or Friedland. But the Russians retreated. Commander-in-Chief Barclay de Tolly avoided battle, luring the French deep into the country. Napoleon pursued, hoping to force a battle. The army moved along dusty roads under a scorching sun. The Russians burned warehouses, drove off cattle, and devastated the area. The French suffered from heat, thirst, and disease. By the end of August, the French reached Smolensk, 500 kilometers from the border. The city was taken by storm on August 17 after a fierce battle. The Russians retreated further. Napoleon was faced with a choice: stop in Smolensk for winter quarters or go to Moscow. His marshals advised stopping. The army was exhausted and had lost a third of its composition to disease and desertion, and communications stretched for hundreds of kilometers. But Napoleon decided to go further. He believed that the capture of Moscow would force Alexander to ask for peace. On the 7th of September 1812, at the village of Borodino, 120 kilometers from Moscow, a general battle occurred. The Russian army under the command of Kutuzov occupied fortified positions and waited. Napoleon had 135,000 men and 600 guns. Kutuzov, 120,000 and 640 guns. The battle began at dawn and lasted until evening. The French attacked the Russian fortifications again and again. The Russians repelled the attacks but suffered huge losses. By evening, they retreated to new positions, but the army was not routed. Borodino was the bloodiest one-day battle of the Napoleonic Wars. The French lost 30,000 men killed or wounded. The Russians, 44,000. The battlefield presented a picture of hell: thousands of mangled people and horses, broken cannons, and fragments of caissons. Napoleon walked the field after the battle and was shaken. He told one of his marshals that this was the most terrible of all my battles. but he believed he had won because the Russians had retreated. In reality, he did not achieve his goal. He did not destroy the Russian army. On September 14, the French entered Moscow. The city was almost empty. The population had been evacuated. Governor Rostopchin ordered the warehouses of food to be set on fire. That same night, a grand fire began. The flames engulfed the wooden quarters, and the wind carried sparks. The fire lasted for several days. 3/4 of the city burned down. Napoleon stood in the courtyard of the Kremlin and watched the ancient capital burn. He realized he was trapped. Moscow could not serve as winter quarters. There was no food. Alexander did not send offers of peace. Napoleon spent a month in Moscow, waiting for the Tsar to come to his senses. He sent letters and offered negotiations, but Alexander did not reply. The French army situation worsened every day. Partisans attacked supply convoys, Cossacks intercepted couriers, soldiers looted, and discipline fell apart. On October 19, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. The army left Moscow and moved south, hoping to escape along a road untouched by war through Kaluga, but Kutuzov blocked the path. On October 12, at Maloyaroslavets, a battle took place. The city changed hands 8 times. The French failed to break through. Napoleon ordered a retreat along the old Smolensk road, by which they had arrived. This road had been devastated even during the advance. The nightmare began. Frost struck. Soldiers dressed in summer uniforms froze by the thousands. Horses fell from hunger and cold. Supply wagons were abandoned. The wounded were left to die on the road. Cossacks and partisans finished off the stragglers. The army turned into a crowd of beggars. On November 1417, at the crossing of the Berezina River, the French were surrounded. Russian armies from 3 sides tried to close the ring. Napoleon ordered pontoon bridges to be built. Sappers worked in icy water. Many died from hypothermia. The army crossed under the fire of Russian artillery. About 30,000 people died, but Napoleon escaped the trap. On December 5, in the town of Smorgon, he left the army and departed for Paris. He handed over command to Murat. Of the 600,000 people who entered Russia, about 30,000 combat-ready soldiers returned. The rest died, were wounded, were captured, or deserted. The Russian campaign was a catastrophe from which the empire did not recover. Napoleon lost his best army, hardened in dozens of battles. His prestige was undermined. His enemies felt his weakness and decided on revenge. A new, 6th anti-French coalition was being formed. In 1813, Napoleon performed a miracle. In a few months, he created a new army. Recruits of the 1,813 and 1,814 classes were called up 17 and 18-year-old boys whom they called Marie-Louises in honor of the Empress. Garrisons were recalled from Spain and Germany. By spring, 200,000 men were under arms. There was a shortage of cavalry and experienced officers who had perished in Russia, but the army existed and could fight. The enemies were advancing from the east. Russia, Prussia, and Sweden united into a new coalition. Austria remained neutral for now but leaned toward an alliance with Russia. The total number of Allied troops exceeded 500,000. The plan was simple. Surround France from several directions and wear the French down with numerical superiority. Napoleon decided to defeat his enemies piece by piece before they could unite. The spring-summer campaign of 1,813 inches Germany showed that the emperor had not lost his command talent. On May 2 at Lützen and on May 2021 at Bautzen, he defeated the Russian-Prussian armies, but without cavalry, he could not pursue and complete the rout. The Allies retreated in order, preserving their forces. On June 4th, an armistice was concluded. Both sides were exhausted. Napoleon hoped for negotiations that would consolidate his power over Germany, but the negotiations in Prague failed. The Allies demanded that France abandon Germany, Poland, Spain, Holland, and Italy all its conquests. Napoleon refused. On August 12, Austria joined the coalition. Now Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, as well as England, which was continuing the war in Spain, were all fighting against France. The chances of victory were melting away, but Napoleon did not surrender. He believed in his star, in the genius that had more than once led him out of desperate situations. The autumn campaign of 1,000 813 was a series of furious but inconclusive battles. Napoleon rushed around Germany, attacking now one, now another Allied army. He won at Dresden on August 26-27, but his marshals suffered defeats. At Kulm, Katzbach, and Dennewitz, French corps were routed. The Allies avoided a general battle with Napoleon, but beat his subordinates. The strategy of attrition was working. On October 16-19, 1813, the Battle of the Nations took place at Leipzig, the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had 190,000 men. The Allies, 330,000. The battle raged for 3 days. The French fought with desperate courage but were overwhelmed by numbers. On October 18, the Saxon and Bavarian troops fighting on Napoleon's side switched to the Allies. The betrayal decided the outcome. Napoleon ordered a retreat. The retreat turned into a flight. The Allies pursued. At the crossing of the Elster River, the bridge was blown up prematurely, cutting off the rear guard. Thousands of Frenchmen died trying to swim across the river. Among the dead was the Polish Prince Poniatowski, a marshal of France. Napoleon led about 70,000 men out of Leipzig. Germany was lost. The Confederation of the Rhine fell apart. Vassal kings fled. Even his own brother Jérôme abandoned the throne of Westphalia and took refuge in France. By the end of 1813, the Allied armies stood on the Rhine, on the French border. For the first time in 20 years, the war had come to French territory. The Allies offered Napoleon peace on terms that left France with its natural borders, the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees. These were honorable terms, but Napoleon hesitated and bargained, hoping to win back the situation. The Allies withdrew the offer. In January 1814, 3 armies invaded France from the east, and one from the south through the Pyrenees. The campaign of 1,814 inches France showed Napoleon at the pinnacle of his command skill. With only 70,000 men against 300,000 allies, he maneuvered for 3 months, attacking now one enemy corps and now another, routing them piece by piece. Victories at Champaubert, Montmiral, and Château-Thierry entered history as models of military art. But these were tactical victories that did not affect the strategic outcome. The Allies lost armies but sent new ones. France, however, had exhausted its manpower reserves. On the 30th of March 1814, Allied troops entered Paris. Napoleon, with the remnants of his army, was 100 kilometers from the capital and did not manage to defend it. Paris capitulated without a fight. On April 2, the Senate, incited by Talleyrand, Napoleon's former Minister of Foreign Affairs, voted for the deprivation of the emperor of his power. The Bourbons were restored. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, was proclaimed King of France. On April 4, in the castle of Fontainebleau, where the emperor had retreated, the marshals gathered. Ney, Davout, Lefebvre, and Oudinot declared that the army would no longer fight. They demanded that Napoleon abdicate. The emperor tried to resist, speaking of honor and duty, but the marshals were unyielding. They were tired of war and wanted peace. On April 6, Napoleon signed his abdication. He renounced the throne for himself and his heirs. The Allies granted him the island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea, a small possession with a population of 12,000. On April 20, at Fontainebleau, Napoleon said goodbye to his guard. He went out to the parade ground, where the old soldiers who had crossed half of Europe with him were lined up. He addressed them with a speech that many remembered for the rest of their lives. He said that he had wanted to make France great, that he had served only its glory, and that the soldiers had been his children. The soldiers wept. Napoleon kissed the flag and hugged General Petit, commander of the guard. Then he got into his carriage and left for his place of exile. On the 28th of April, 1814, Napoleon landed on the island of Elba. The island was tiny, 27 kilometers long and 18 wide. The capital was the city of Porto Ferraio, with a population of 3,000. Here was to end the days of the man who had ruled 60 million subjects. The emperor received a pension from the French government, had a personal guard of 600 men, and retained the title of Emperor of Elba. He set about organizing his microscopic domain. Napoleon built roads, a hospital, and a school. He modernized the port and developed fishing and the mining of iron ore, with which the island was rich. He walked in the mountains, read books, and dictated his memoirs. His mother, Letizia, his sister Pauline, and a few loyal friends joined him. His wife, Marie-Louise, and his son remained in Austria. Her father, Emperor Francis, did not let them go to Napoleon. She received the Duchy of Parma in Italy as a possession, and soon took a lover, an Austrian officer named Neipperg. Napoleon suffered but could do nothing. In France, meanwhile, the Restoration regime caused universal discontent. Louis XVIII returned the émigrés, restored noble privileges, and surrounded himself with elderly aristocrats who had forgotten nothing and learned nothing. Veterans of the Grand Army, peasants who had bought the lands of the former church and émigrés, and industrialists who had enriched themselves under the empire, were afraid of losing the gains of the revolution. Rumors spread that the king would return the lands to the church, and the nobles. Discontent grew. Napoleon on Elba followed the events closely. On the 26th of February 1815, Napoleon boarded ships with 1,000 soldiers and sailed from Elba. 4 days later, he landed in the south of France near Cannes. The government sent troops for his arrest. But the soldiers did not fire at the former emperor. Napoleon walked toward them, opening his coat, and shouted, "Soldiers, if there is anyone among you who wants to kill his emperor, here I am." The troops crossed over to his side. Marshal Ney, who had promised the king to bring Bonaparte back in an iron cage, wept upon meeting the emperor and joined him. On the 20th of March 1815, Napoleon entered Paris without a single shot being fired. Louis XVIII had fled to Belgium the previous night. This was a triumphant return, unprecedented in history. The man who had been overthrown a year before returned and restored his power by the sheer force of personal charm and popular love. Europe was shocked. The Allies declared Napoleon an outlaw and decided to move their armies against France once again. England, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and many minor states rose against him. They mobilized over 1 million soldiers. Napoleon tried to reconcile with Europe. He stated that he did not claim any conquests and wanted peace within the borders of France. He granted a liberal constitution, which guaranteed the freedoms of citizens and limited his power. But the Allies did not believe him. They demanded unconditional surrender. Napoleon realized that war was inevitable. He began to form an army. In 3 months, he gathered 200,000 men. These were veterans, but poorly armed and trained. The Allies were gathering huge forces at the French borders. Napoleon decided to strike first before the Allies could unite. The closest were the Anglo-Dutch army of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army of Blücher, stationed in Belgium. On June 15, the French army crossed the Belgian border. The plan was simple: insert itself between the English and the Prussians and defeat them one by one. On June 16, Napoleon attacked the Prussians at Ligny and dealt them a heavy defeat. Blücher retreated to the north. At the same time, Marshal Ney's corps attacked the English at Quatre Bras but failed to rout them. On the 18th of June 1815, at the village of Waterloo, 20 kilometers south of Brussels, a battle occurred that decided Napoleon's fate. Wellington's army occupied a defensive position on a ridge of hills. Napoleon had 72,000 men. Wellington, 68,000. The battle began around noon. The French attacked the British positions again and again. The British infantry repelled the attacks, forming into squares. The French cavalry of Ney attacked up to 12 times but could not break the formation. By evening, Blücher's Prussians arrived. Napoleon sent a corps against them, but there were not enough forces. The French army found itself caught between 2 fires. At 7 in the evening, Napoleon threw his old guard into the final attack, his best troops, who had never known defeat. The guard marched into the attack to the beat of drums but was met with murderous fire from British infantry and artillery. For the first time in history, the guard retreated. This was the end. The army fled in a rout. Napoleon barely escaped. On June 22, Napoleon returned to Paris. The Chamber of Deputies demanded his abdication. He tried to resist but understood that he had lost. On June 22, he abdicated for the second time in favor of his son. But the Allies did not recognize the abdication. They demanded unconditional surrender. On July 15, Napoleon surrendered to the English, hoping to receive asylum in England. He wrote a letter to the Prince Regent, the future George IV, asking for protection. But the English did not wish to keep a dangerous prisoner in Europe. The Allies decided to exile Napoleon to the island of Saint Helena, lost in the Atlantic Ocean, 2,000 kilometers from the nearest African coast. On the 7th of August 1815, The former emperor was put on the English ship Bellerophon, then transferred to the Northumberland. On October 15, he arrived on Saint Helena. It was a rocky island of volcanic origin, joyless and with a harsh climate. Here, Napoleon was to spend the rest of his life. The prisoner's residence was Longwood House, a gloomy house deep in the island, surrounded by bare hills. The house was damp and cold, with low ceilings and cramped rooms. Winds blew from the ocean, bringing mists and rains. Napoleon lived with several companions who shared his exile. Among them were General Bertrand, the former chief of staff, Count Montholon, Count Las Cases, and Dr. O'Meara, the English governor of the island. Hudson Lowe treated the prisoner with cold politeness, but kept him under strict surveillance. Napoleon spent his days dictating his memoirs. He told of his campaigns, justified his actions, and created a legend of himself as a defender of the revolution and a fighter for the freedom of nations. The memoirs were smuggled to Europe and published, creating a cult of Napoleon. He read books sent from Europe, took walks in the garden, and played cards. But boredom and illness undermined his strength. He began to suffer from stomach pains, vomiting, and weakness. The English doctor suspected hepatitis or an ulcer. In the spring of 1821, Napoleon's condition deteriorated sharply. He was bedridden, barely able to rise, and refused food. Dr. Antomarchi, a Corsican doctor who had arrived on the island at the request of Napoleon's mother, could not help. On the 5th of May 1821, at 5:30 in the evening, Napoleon Bonaparte passed away. He was 51 years old. The autopsy showed stomach cancer. Modern researchers argue about the causes of death. Some believe he was poisoned with arsenic, but most lean toward the version of death from natural causes due to illness. On May 9, Napoleon was buried on Saint Helena in a valley he had loved. The coffin was lowered into a grave lined with stone. The English did not allow the inscription Napoleon to be placed on it, insisting on Napoleon Bonaparte, but the French refused, and the grave remained nameless. In 1840, under a different regime, Napoleon's remains were transported to France. On the 15th of December 1840, in a solemn ceremony, the coffin with the emperor's ashes was installed in the Les Invalides in Paris. There it rests to this day, a symbol of the greatness and tragedy of France.